A war over words. Donald Trump and the media go to battle, but who will come out on top? And could U.S. democracy be one of the casualties? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the U.S. president versus the press. From Donald Trump's very first news conference, he's had a hostile relationship with the media. He's accused them of producing fake news, sowing distrust, and says they can even cause war. Now, for centuries, a free press has been a pillar of U.S. democracy, but could Trump's attacks be eroding that principle? Well, some in the media think so, and they're fighting back. More than 300 news outlets teamed up to condemn what they see as the president's assault on the free press. So, are the media, as Trump says, the enemy of the people, or is he setting himself up as an enemy of credible journalism? That debate in a moment, but first, here's Sandra Gatman.
It's the press versus the president.
Is a question an attack?
Fake news. Fake news.
Donald Trump's presidency can be defined by lies.
Donald Trump's critics say they're correcting falsehoods he's made.
You said today that you had the biggest electoral margin since Ronald Reagan with 304, 306.
In fact, President Obama got 365 in 2008.
Well, I'm talking about Republican.
President Obama 332,
Yeah.
and George H.W. Bush 426. So why should Americans trust you when you're misrepresenting information?
Trump believes the media is out to topple his presidency.
The fake media tried to stop us from going to the White House, but I'm president and they're not.
The media feuds have been endless. Critics have focused on investigations into whether Trump campaign officials colluded with Russia to win the 2016 elections. But Trump says in the absence of real evidence, the media is just speculating.
Fake news and the Russian witch hunt. We got a whole big combination. Where is the collusion?
Then there's Michael Cohen, the president's personal lawyer, who's publicly admitted he paid a woman claiming she'd had an affair with Trump to keep quiet. But Trump shook off the accusations. Despite the feuds, the media are making hay. Most major U.S. networks and newspapers have enjoyed record ratings and subscriptions, possibly thanks to political divisions Trump has fueled. But CNN's White House correspondent Jim Acosta has come under fire for his rise to fame as Trump's biggest TV critic, often putting himself at the center of the story.
The President of the United States should not refer to us as the enemy of the people. His own daughter acknowledges that, and all I'm asking you to do, Sarah, is to acknowledge that right now and right here.
I appreciate your passion.
In reaction to being labeled fake news, many media companies are investing in fact-checking. But tech giants and online platforms are also going further, shutting down outlets believed to be spreading falsehoods and hate speech. President Trump says that amounts to censorship.
They're really treading on very, very troubled territory, and they have to be careful. It's not fair to large portions of the population.
And apparently many Americans agree. A recent Pew Research survey found that 72% believe social media platforms actively censor political views they object to. Much of the media is worried. Last week, 300 U.S. newspapers coordinated editorials about how the president's labeling of the media as the enemy of the people could harm journalism and even journalists. The New York Times wrote,
"News reporters and editors are human and make mistakes. Correcting them is core to our job, but insisting that truths you don't like are fake news is dangerous to the lifeblood of democracy, and calling journalists the enemy of the people is dangerous, period."
The UN's human rights chief also chimed in, suggesting the president could be blamed for inciting violence.
Could possibly set in train an atmosphere where journalists are self-censoring or deciding not to venture into certain parts of the country where they believed it would be dangerous and threatening to their physical security. And then ultimately, if viewed in that context, it could amount to incitement.
Another casualty in the battle for truth might be truth itself, as Trump and the press harden their resolve to win over the people of America. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now is Marcela Garcia in Boston. She is an editorial board member for the Boston Globe. And in Philadelphia, we have Michael Johns. He was a speechwriter for President George H.W. Bush and is now the leader and co-founder of the National Tea Party movement. Thanks both so much for joining us. Let me begin in Boston. Marcela, this, I dare say, is really unprecedented, the state of the relationship between the White House and the U.S. press right now. You tell me, how genuinely worried are you that this kind of current standoff could actually damage the U.S. democracy?
Yes, I believe it could. And just to be clear, presidents all throughout history have tried to undermine the press and the work that we do, which is enshrined in the Constitution, right? But we sort of felt that this rhetoric coming from the president, calling journalists here in the U.S. the enemy of the people, we felt that that rhetoric had essentially crossed a line because it was basically putting into question, again, the work that we do that is so vital to democracy. And again, it's enshrined in the Constitution. And that's exactly why we decided to do this project. This was not meant to be an attack on the president like many people have characterized it. Instead, it was just a call to, to make the voice of the press heard collectively. We wanted us to have a say in this debate that had been developing without the press basically, having a say. And we felt that the editorial and the opinion pages of newspapers were the right place to do it. We put out a call to newspapers across the country. More than 400 responded from every state, from all 50 states in the country. And I think that is one of the most remarkable things about this project, that people think of the media as people in New York, in California, but there's, the average American journalist is working for a community newspaper, covering its local election, its local elected officials. And that's what we wanted to elevate, that the work that we do is to inform the public, but also to hold elected officials from the city council, from a school board member all the way to the White House. So again, this was not about attacking the White House or the president. It was about elevating and defending and reaffirming our right to have a free press in this country.
Okay. Michael Johns, some on the other side actually argue that the president is protecting the U.S. democracy because he's fighting fake and manipulative news that is undemocratic anyway. Are you in that camp?
Yeah, I am. Poll after poll in this country have shown that the American people believe that there is a very strong left-of-center bias in the American media. That's gone on for decades, but it's become increasingly worse. We're, an example after example from the standpoint of political donations, from the standpoint of their political party affiliations, to the point of the 90% by an independent media organization's negative coverage of the president. That's become indisputable. So I don't think when the president lambasts the mainstream media that he is necessarily preaching to them. He's more or less projecting to them what they already know, which is one of the reasons it's been received so well and so positively by both supporters and even those who've been more neutral on it. There clearly is an amazing and very concerning level of tension between mainstream media and this particular administration. And it's really my position that the mainstream media has invited that tension in assigning all sorts of negative adjectives and descriptions and bias in the coverage, both in omitting positive coverage and in dwelling on make-believe stories like Russian collusion.
Michael, then tell me what you think should be done to clamp down on a biased media that's being dishonest.
I don't think it's a clamping down. I think a few things that have already been done, and number one is that you're seeing that the number of media outlets in the United States is beginning to increase. Conservatives that have given up, a lot of hope in mainstream media's objectivity have started their own outlets. Those are growing in force. And the American people's engagement with mainstream media is falling off. I was astonished think about a week ago to see a statistic that 2% of American teenagers read a U.S. daily newspaper. Now, there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. They're all concerning, but one of them is the lack of confidence and faith that the American people have that they're going to get the straight story from mainstream media when it's presented to them. So I think the burden does fall on mainstream media to treat this president, the conservative movement, the Tea Party movement, Republicans in Congress more objectively and to cover them more objectively, and frankly, to spend more time around them. I mean, it is true that mainstream media in this country have largely spent their time in Manhattan, in Washington, D.C., in Los Angeles. And that's, not America. Those are 3 cities that are islands to themselves.
It's still America. I think so. Marcela is probably from one of those major metropolitan areas. It is. Marcela,
Not
let me ask.
reflective of Americans, I should say.
It is a very diverse country. Marcela, let me ask you this. We saw in that report the concerns of the UN human rights chief on this issue, that the president's attacks on the press could likely lead, he says, to injury or worse. Do you think that's a valid criticism?
Yeah, absolutely, it is. And if you ask any journalist, again, and ask people in the middle of the country, ask people who work in community newspapers that basically cover, again, their communities, their local elections, the things that are important to those communities. Ask any journalist. I don't think, I don't think no one would say that they have seen an increased hostility towards them because of the work that they do. Again, I think we felt that this rhetoric crosses a line, and and I would defend Michael's right to to say and to create more media outlets that are more representative of America as a whole and in every corner of this country. That's what this project was about. It was really about defending the freedom of the press, free speech, and basically defending our work, what we do. And it was just not about the Globe or the New York Times or the Washington Post, who didn't even participate in this project. It was about the little papers in Iowa, in Michigan, everywhere across the country that are feeling this incredibly, hostile environment. And like I said, it's something that we as a journalist have always faced, but it's definitely increased.
Michael Johns, I need to put this to you. The National Enquirer, one of President Trump's, or at least formerly one of President Trump's favorite newspapers, admitted to basically burying stories that could have marred Trump's campaign while it was running cover stories with, huge headlines that said Hillary Clinton is going to jail. I find it interesting that you have so much disdain for what you call the liberal media, when the media that was on the president's side was actually engaging in that behavior.
I don't think anyone, at least anyone serious in American politics, would view that medium as a particularly serious outlet.
President Trump said they should have been eligible for a Pulitzer Prize.
Stories. Well, they did break a few stories that actually technically were accurate and were missed by mainstream media, including the Edwards issue a few years ago, multiple other incidents. But they are a sensationalist media outlet that really, in my judgment, is not one that is even attempting to be taken seriously.
But it's also one of the best-selling papers in the United States.
Yeah, I guess that's what happens when you put it next to a cashier's register at a grocery store, and when you feed a kind of sensationalist approach to media coverage. And frankly, I'm not. There's a role for it. I guess it's constructive that it's there. They're facing some issues right now, for sure, from everything that I've seen, including a lot of litigation. So, but I don't think that was really a centerpiece of coverage of the 2016 election or of the tension that exists between mainstream media and this administration since. The issue right now is, and I'm intrigued in a lot of ways with one aspect of this outreach on really condemning the president's rhetoric by media outlets. And it shows a level of groupthink and collaboration and almost a conscious effort to go out and bring them into a central line of thinking. And I thought a lot about a few years ago when the so-called journo list was exposed in the United States. This was a list of hundreds of mainstream media outlets that were essentially conspiring on how to disparage conservatives and Republicans, talking about tactics, talking about approaches. You read through that and you can't come away with any degree of conclusion other than the fact that the American media have become parts of the Democratic establishment and parts of the progressive movement. Now, it's not my role really, and I don't pretend to play the role of telling them exactly what to do, but I do believe that their credibility and their audience has fallen off as a result of that, and they owe it to themselves, and if they're publicly traded companies, they owe it to their shareholders to get back into doing really what their role is in a democratic republic, and that is to cover objectively the news of this administration and the political movements in the country and the sentiments of the American people.
Okay.
They can do that successfully if they make the effort. They have not made the effort, and it's been a profession that's drawn, I think, individuals that have wanted to be advocates and really belong more in political advocacy than they do in mainstream media.
Marcela, do go ahead. I saw you had a response.
Yeah, I would like to address one of this notion of groupthink and collaboration around this project, because there's a difference between groupthink and solidarity. Again, this was not an attempt to lead a war or an attack. It was the contrary. We invited newspapers who felt the need to reaffirm our right enshrined in the Constitution to have a free press. And that's all it was. I don't really understand why defending a free press should be so controversial. That's really what this is all about. And again, there was this, criticism that immediately came out about groupthink and collaboration, and the president tweeted to, using the word collusion. There's no collusion here. Each newspaper wrote its own editorial. We even had a newspaper who wrote an editorial arguing
But you
against
solicited it. You solicited it. You went out and solicited it.
We asked,
right?
Of course, absolutely.
Yeah.
We invited.
You didn't allow them to independently reach the conclusion about how they would approach it or view it or report it. You went out with a thesis and said, who's on board with us?
They didn't participate. A lot of newspapers didn't participate, like the Washington Post, and they had their own reasons for not participating, and that's totally valid. And some newspapers, allow me to continue, some newspapers who did participate even wrote their own editorials arguing against our own project, which was totally valid. And we put it in our website, compiling all of the newspapers. Each newspaper wrote what they wanted to write. That's not collusion to me. And again, why should it be so controversial to defend the free press in America? Again, that's in the Constitution. Why should it be so controversial?
Let me ask you this then, Marcela. I mean, are we
Well, it's controversial in a sense because no one's threatening a free press. I don't think there's anyone who's been critical of mainstream media who denies the right of media to exist or would impede First Amendment rights that are constitutionally guaranteed. I think most conservatives, members of this administration included, are strong advocates of the Bill of Rights and particularly the First Amendment, which is central to American freedom. The issue, I think, here has been, this is not the first, second, or third example of a level of collusion among mainstream media. It's almost singularly and always designed to tear down conservatives and this administration. And I think my question to you would be, when Madonna said she was going to blow up the White House, or when other extremist movements on the left threatened this administration with violence, or even members of the media implied jokingly or somewhat seriously that was okay, did you ponder going out to other media outlets then and asking them to come together and condemn violent rhetoric of that nature? Because I didn't see that.
Look, this is just whataboutism, and we can argue forever on what about this, what about that, what about this. Again,
but you didn't do it.
Was just,
you didn't do it.
We did. We have constantly
It wasn't
published
important. It wasn't
editorials and
important enough to
opinion
you
pieces.
at that. It wasn't important enough to you at the time to do it.
Michael, that's just your opinion right now. Obviously, a lot of newspapers around the world,
Well, why
around
didn't you
the
do it?
country,
Why
not
didn't you do it?
just
Let me
in New York.
forget my opinion. Why didn't you do it? Why
I
didn't
already
you?
said what we did. We did. No. You are asking me to prove a negative. No, I can't. I'm only here talking about the free press, and you're trying to move it to a different direction because you cannot accept the fact that it was not just the mainstream media, how you call it, the people that are concerned about the independence on the free press right at this moment. It was 400 newspapers in the country. Ask them, each one of them. Read the editorials. I invite you to read the editorials to see what is there, to see that there's no collusion right here, and this is all about free press.
Michael Johns, let me just put this to you, because as much as you say that there's this huge liberal bias among, some of the leading newspapers in the United States and the leading media organizations, I really have to ask you how much you think this actually matters, because Trump supporters don't seem to care. He still won the election, and ultimately that's all that really matters to him. So how do you keep arguing there's this unfair bias toward a side that has lost elections?
I think both facts are true. I think it is indisputably true, and it's been demonstrated both in political party affiliation and in coverage, example after example after example. 90% of negative coverage of the mainstream media has been negative. But it's also true, as you very correctly point out, that this administration, this particular president, has really done an exceptional job in beginning to communicate directly with the American people, and to do that through social media outlets, to do that through large rallies, and to go directly and not rely on a filter for his message. And he's been criticized by the mainstream media for doing that, in my view, because they want to have a monopolization on the way that this administration is presented to the American people. But you're exactly right that it is proven successful, and a large part of that is that the American people have lost credibility in the mainstream media outlet. I believe, and I would agree with
I only have a
Marcela
minute.
That the mainstream media is a core part of our freedom and of our First Amendment.
Right.
So anyone who cares about freedom would want to see our mainstream media credibility restored.
Marcela, very quickly, I mean, it's nice to hear those words from Michael Johns at the end, but will the U.S. press political dynamic ever be the same again after this episode with this administration?
I don't know. I guess we'll have to wait and see. But again, we felt that the collective voice of the press needed to be heard in this debate, and that's what we did. Why we did what we did. I guess we're going to see. Who knows what's going to happen in the 2020 election? Who knows what's going to happen in November in these midterm elections? We just have to wait and see. I really cannot predict how the climate is going to change or is going to improve. I mean, that's another thing about this project. We did not mean to use it as a persuasive tool. I mean, that's the other thing that has been mischaracterized. We don't want to change people's minds. This is just an opinion.
Okay. Marcela Garcia, I will have to let you have the last word. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this segment of the Newsmakers. Thank you both so much for joining us. Still to come, Sweden's economy gets a boost from refugees. We ask if the rest of Europe should be paying attention. And we debate the price of humanitarian aid after India rejects $100 million from the UAE. From Italy's Matteo Salvini to Hungary's Viktor Orban, there isn't a single country in Europe where far-right candidates haven't tapped into rising anti-immigration rhetoric. New arrivals are accused of stealing jobs and draining economies, but one country is proving them all wrong: Sweden. Its economy has received a significant boost from immigration. Its generous intake of refugees has largely solved challenges it faced with an otherwise aging population. Now, the refugee crisis has certainly taken a toll on Europe, but could following Sweden's example turn a crisis into an economic success story?
So with immigration, you better be smart and you better be tough, and they're taking your jobs, and you better be careful. You better be careful.
People here don't understand. They're too wealthy. They don't get what open door mass immigration as a result of EU membership has done to people's wages, to people's availability of getting GP appointments or their kids into local schools.
Well, to discuss this further, I'm joined now from Washington, D.C. by Jalal Özden. He is a senior economist at the World Bank, and also in the U.S. Capitol, we have Stephen Camarota, the Director of Research at the Center for Immigration Studies. Thanks both so much for joining us. Let me begin with Jalal. I mean, overall, is there a net benefit to immigration that's deliberately being either overlooked or ignored by right-wing elements in Western democracies like Europe and the United States?
Well, I don't want to comment on the right-wing elements, but the academic research shows that there is a net benefit to immigration. Of course, there are distributional impacts, and that's where the debate is arising. And the debate we are seeing, I mean, it's because the issues are complex and require thoughtful and cool heads sitting down and debating based on the data and the research. But the overall effect is clearly positive.
Okay, Stephen Camarota, is there a lack of thoughtful and cool heads looking at the realities of the economics of immigration and particularly its benefits?
Yeah, I mean, in the United States in particular, there is a tendency to see only the costs or, on the other hand, to sentimentalize immigration. Well, my great-grandmother came to America as an immigrant, and everything worked out fine back then, and so immigration must be a great deal today. So the complexity of immigration, as the other guest mentioned, the distributional effects, who wins, who loses from immigration, those kind of things often get lost. The other big issue when it comes to immigration is which immigrants. The research shows, for example, that if someone were to come to, whether it's a country in Western Europe or the United States, with a lot of education, generally finds a good job, they tend to pay a lot in taxes, and they don't need that much in social services. On the other hand, if someone comes with relatively modest levels of education, they still usually find a job, especially in the United States, but they don't tend to pay much in taxes, and they tend to use a lot in public services. So when we think about the net effect of immigration, we have to think about which immigrants. The most skilled immigrants generally, for example, have a positive fiscal impact for taxpayers. The less educated immigrants generally have a negative fiscal impact. So it depends very much on which immigrant flow you're talking about.
Well, on those immigrant flows, I mean, let's look at the less...
And if I can intervene here
Go ahead, Jalal.
Sorry. And I fully agree. Yeah, I fully agree with Dr. Camarota, and it's all about distributional impacts, and that's hence the the intensity of the political debate. But into the economic analysis, and the researchers forget to include these, there are labor market externalities, positive spillovers that accrue to the natives with complementary skills and to the consumers. And those are really hard to quantify. The taxes you pay and the salary you get paid and the social services you withdraw with the system are clearly observable. But the other benefits are much more difficult to measure, and that's hence the part of the lopsided debate on the benefits of immigration. So if an immigrant comes here and is a fruit picker, I benefit from cheap and good quality fruits, but that doesn't really enter the calculation. Similarly, I work with wonderful technicians and secretaries and managers from all over the world, and that improves my productivity and creates an economic spillover, and that doesn't get calculated. When we include all of these benefits, pretty much almost every group in the economy provides a net value added to the immigrant destination. But what happens is the impact on the natives, different natives in the labor market get impacted differently. And that's where I think the political focus should be. And I fully agree with Dr. Camarota in that respect.
Okay. Well, let's look at the one segment, Stephen Camarota, that you were talking about, and those less skilled people that come into the country, which seems to be getting a lot of negative attention in the United States, when the truth is, and let's be honest, there isn't a huge welfare state in the United States of America the way there is, for example, in Europe. The U.S. doesn't just dole out benefits to poor people, especially if you're not a citizen. So meanwhile, these unskilled laborers come over and they help the biggest agricultural state in the world, basically, the state of California, with relatively inexpensive labor to pick their fields. California is having a real battle with that right now and getting workers to come across the border, mostly from Mexico, and help them do these manual labor jobs. Is that being under-addressed, do you think, by the political debate in the United States?
No. In fact, I would, with due respect, disagree with one thing. There's nothing that dominates this debate. I get this question all the time. Agricultural labor. What are we going to do with agricultural labor? Everybody agrees agricultural labor in the United States, immigration is almost irrelevant to it. 2% of all immigrants who come and work in the United States work in agriculture. Of illegal immigrants, the least skilled, the people who come illegally, about 4%. 96% of all illegal immigrants, by everyone's account, work outside of agriculture. It's also true that the United States has an unlimited agricultural program that lets farmers bring in workers, but they have to pay them a certain way and provide them with housing and treat them in a certain way. And that's one of the things that farmers don't like to do. They like just having a much more unregulated flow of people with fewer labor market protections and so forth. It's understandable why they like that. The other thing always to remember is that if we decided to curtail that immigration and let wages rise in the agricultural sector, it would almost mean nothing to the American consumer. When you buy a head of lettuce in the United States or any kind of fresh fruit, of that total, only about 18% actually goes back to the farm, and only 6% goes back to the worker who actually picked the lettuce or the strawberries. If we let wages rise, which are pretty low in the agricultural sector when you consider how tough the jobs are, if we let wages rise by 50% in the agricultural sector, it could only add to the price of fresh fruit and produce, something Americans don't consume in very high volume, about 3%. And that's a one-time increase, assuming everything gets transferred on.
Okay, Chalar, if you had a comment, go ahead. If not, I'll move on to another issue.
There are certain occupations, including fruit pickers and lettuce pickers, which the ratio of the immigrants is quite high. But then it's because you have to look at the overall denominator. If you look at engineering professors in the United States, there are not that many of them, but 65% of them are immigrants. So if I pull out those immigrants, the engineering education in the United States would collapse. So it's similarly, if I were to pull out the immigrants, in most likelihood, because we don't know the counterfactual, neither of us do, probably agricultural output would collapse. But nevertheless, agriculture, I agree, can be, suppose we can put machines that pick the lettuce. I don't know if anybody has ever done it, but they might. But also there are so many other occupations at the low skill end that is not open to technology yet. Whether if this is construction, whether if this is hospitality services. If you were to remove the unskilled immigrants, those economies, those sectors, especially the millions, tens of millions of Americans who work in these other areas, alongside with the immigrants, with complementary skills, they would lose their jobs because the sectors would shrink. I think that's what we are ignoring. We are comparing the natives and the immigrants in the exact same occupations, but we are ignoring the complementary occupations.
Okay, Jalal, if I can stick with you for a minute, because actually leading into this debate, we looked at a study specifically about Sweden and how it has now some of the highest, if not the highest, growth rates in Europe. And they are crediting that to its increasing immigrant population that has actually contributed so much to the economy. Yet, these anti-immigrant rhetoric is still on the rise there. Let me ask you why, I know you don't like to comment too much on the political issues here, but is there a risk that harm can be done to the economy because the rhetoric, anti-immigrant rhetoric, is so strong, even though it's showing in a European country like Sweden that immigration is of great net benefit?
Okay, let me put it this way. I'm an academic researcher, and I find myself extremely fortunate to be living through these times. Basically, between 1980 and 2050, the world is going to go through amazing transitions. There are three big transitions we are living through, and we're not even fully aware of it. One is the technological transition. We pay lip service to it, but we don't fully know it yet, the ramifications. The second one is the demographic transition. Again, slow-moving truck, the aging in Europe and in China, in Japan, in the US. And the third one is basically the environmental change, right? So the issue is to smooth out these big long-term transitions. By focusing on lettuce pickers in California, we are basically forcing ourselves to look at this really narrow political dimension and ignore the big picture. So if you look at the big picture, especially in the West, whether if it's Europe or the US or Japan or Australia, if you look at these three big demographic, technological, and environmental transitions, population movement from low-income areas to high-income areas. I'm not saying open the floodgates, but respond to the markets will make the transition much smoother and benefit everybody, especially the West, because these transitions need to be managed because 2050 is going to come and we're going to say, oh my God, we wasted the last 7 years. That's what we should be debating about, not the lettuce pickers in California.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, Stephen, is there a problem that perhaps we're not responding to the markets in the way that Jalal was saying is necessary, and instead responding to a political debate that might not have all the right information and is selling that lack of information to a public that responds to rhetoric that's not healthy for anyone?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to echo what he said about thinking about lettuce pickers. That was my point about trying to point out to you how trivial it is, a fraction. But you were asking something about agriculture, so I thought I would give you some of the data on that. On the larger question, I agree. We should be thinking about the larger question. And it's true that advanced industrial democracies can benefit from some immigration and a regulated flow. Whether the receiving society on balance, when you look at the economic benefits and the fiscal impact, actually are better off, now we get to a very complicated question, and it's just not clear, at least in the American context, which I know best, but also in Europe. So you asked about Sweden. Let me give you the numbers for the United States. There's just no question that the U.S. economy is at least 1.5, but more like $1.8 trillion larger because of the presence of immigrants. They provide about 17% of the labor in the United States, and labor, as you know, is a very large input to gross domestic product. So, yes, the U.S. economy is bigger. But as we all know, bigger isn't necessarily better. Remember, Bangladesh has a bigger economy than New Zealand. But we wouldn't say, well, therefore it's richer. What matters is the per capita income. And what most people are interested in is the gains to the native born. It does appear that on balance, the immigrants benefit by coming. And the question is, do the natives benefit when you look at the big picture? And there you get a lot of different answers. The poor in the United States probably are worse off. Owners of capital are probably better off. And it's a mixed mixed picture, but on balance, the taxpayers are probably somewhat worse off, but consumers are probably slightly better off. It's a mixed picture. So the bottom line is the economy is bigger. It's not clear if it's richer, and some Americans often at the bottom are poor, and some more who tend to be more educated and own capital tend to be better off from immigration. And that's the way you have to see it. And I do think there's a lot of unnecessary rhetoric, but in the American context, a lot of it pretends immigration is all good with no costs, or sometimes it's all cost and no benefits, when the truth usually lies somewhere in between.
Okay, Stephen Camarota, with that, we're going to have to leave this segment of the debate here because we're completely out of time. I'd like to thank you both so much for your insights on the Newsmakers.
My pleasure.
I have come back to my house after 8 days, and I just looked around. Everything is lost. All my food, all my groceries, rice, everything.
In August, people in the southern Indian state of Kerala experienced the worst flooding in nearly a century. Now, more than 400 people were killed, with millions more displaced in refugee camps. The humanitarian need is massive, and the United Arab Emirates wanted to help by donating $100 million. But India's federal government rejected the offer, saying it can manage the crisis itself. It's a position one imagines many developing countries would like to take to wean themselves off foreign aid. But does that increase victim suffering or move a country towards self-sufficiency? Well, one of the world's leading voices calling for aid reform is Robtel Nejai Paley. She's an academic, activist, and author in Monrovia, Liberia, and she joins us now live on the Newsmakers. Thanks so much for speaking to us. Granted, there are other issues at play here, I know, between India's federal government and the Kerala state government, but overall, do you think India, at least in part, is doing the right thing by trying to manage this very expensive recovery by themselves?
Well, without knowing very much about the context with the Kerala refusal, I can say generally countries that do refuse aid are doing a service to their citizens. And the reason I say that is because I think aid quite often is framed as something that's altruistic. But I think quite often, more often than not, aid is actually strategic. It breeds a culture of dependency, it lacks accountability, and it primarily serves the interests of donors. So countries who decide that they want to be self-sufficient, like the case of India in this particular instance, I think are actually stepping on their own feet and saying, you know what, we want to be able to do this for ourselves and our country, and we want to be able to respond in a manner that is dignified, that doesn't have people dictating to us how we must use the money. So I think it's a step in the right direction. Okay. I mean, from my own continent of Africa, there are examples in which other countries have done the same thing. So I'll give you a classic example. In Sierra Leone, a number of years ago, the Chinese government offered to build a bridge from the airport, which is on an island, Lungi Airport, to the mainland. And the government of Sierra Leone declined because China actually said to them that they wanted everything under the bridge, pretty much the waters. And Sierra Leone, the government of Sierra Leone said no, because at the end of the day, we don't know what's under the water. We don't know. It could be oil. It could be natural resources that could eventually build our revenue base. So that's another example of a country that's relatively poor in terms of, per capita income, telling a very huge international donor, no, we don't want your money. We don't want your bridge.
But I feel like in that case, there was a clear, somewhat nefarious agenda for China's offer of what they may have called aid, but what you see as something that really is more in China's self-interest. Tell us, though, what you present as an alternative to accepting aid, a realistic alternative to accepting donors' money, especially in the case of natural disaster recovery, for example, that Africa has needed help on various occasions.
Sure, I think there are a number of alternatives. So I want to make the point clear that if you look at remittances, for instance, transfers that come from migrants abroad to their countries of origin, remittances are in the billions of dollars, and they far surpass overseas development assistance aid as we know it. So I think countries can, look at their diaspora as a source of building a revenue base, as a source of poverty reduction, as a source of filling a gap that perhaps governments cannot fill because they're cash strapped. I think another way governments can fill that void, and they're already doing so, is to diversify their economies. To not look at an extraction-based economy where they're constantly taking out raw natural resources and sending it to the so-called developed world, that they're actually building an industrial base, that they're actually using those raw natural resources and making something out of it to export. I think countries have a number of different options. They can look at regional integration strategies so that, for instance, West Africa, where I find myself, cocoa in Ghana, cocoa in Ivory Coast is quite prevalent. In countries that produce cocoa, they need to figure out a way, and Ghana is already doing that, of making sure that they can produce chocolate so that they can export chocolate to the outside world. Chocolate is a billion-dollar industry.
I get that. I get that. And what you're saying, and you're advocating for structural change, all of that makes perfect sense. But essentially, at the heart of implementing the kind of change you're talking about, you need good government. Now, even the most developed countries in the world are struggling with good government, particularly right now. So is it really realistic to talk about advocating for this kind of responsible, lack of corruption government that really thinks about moving its country forward, when it's not realistic? And then this aid turns out to just be better than an even worse alternative.
I disagree. There's nothing unrealistic about diversifying your revenue base. There's nothing unrealistic about looking into your diaspora and funding diaspora bonds. These things are already happening in the continent. They're happening outside of the continent. So to say that it's unrealistic, I think, is completely unfair. These things are already taking place. Now, it takes a lot of citizens, civil society, on the ground to make sure that governments are held to account. And more movements, social movements across the continent, across the globe are happening where citizens are demanding service delivery. Citizens are demanding that governments do not siphon off funds to use for means that are not going to eventually serve the interests of citizens. It's already happening on the ground, and we see it every single day.
Tell me where. Give us a clear example that says this is a model we can follow and scale.
Rwanda is a classic example of a government that is responsive and responsible to its citizens. Now, in terms of the democratic dividends in the country, that's a different story altogether. But Rwanda was a severely ravaged country after the genocide in 1994. Just in a matter of 20 years, Rwanda has been able to turn around everything. It's using, the guerrilla sanctuary in rural parts of its country as a form of tourism that's bringing in revenue to the country. It's looking at regional countries as a means of bringing in revenue to the country. It's clamping down on corruption and waste of government resources and revenue considerably. I can go on and on and on about how Rwanda has become, this sort of post-genocide success story when it comes to development, when it comes to economic reforms.
And I mean, one of Africa's top economists, as you know, Dambisa Moyo advocated for this more than a decade ago. She also pulled up Rwanda as an example, as a model to follow. Tell us why the progress then has been so slow, since your argument has been out there for quite some time now.
I can give you some examples. I can give you some examples that are both exogenous as well as endogenous. I think in terms of exogenous examples, I think the same so-called Western governments that are doling out cash or grants or loans in the terms of in the form of aid will use military aid, for example, to support dictatorial regimes across the globe because they serve their interests, right? They will pour money into an Egypt under Mubarak in order to create a buffer in the Middle East. They will pour money into Burkina Faso under Blaise Compaoré, as an example, to continue to have a base in the Sahel. They will continue to pour money into Ethiopia under Meles Zenawi to ensure that they have a base within the Horn of Africa. So that's an exogenous example of Western governments supporting institutions and governments within the quote-unquote developing world to serve their interests. And these governments are not accountable to their citizens. They're certainly not accountable to ensuring that there are economic reforms that eventually serve the interests of the citizen. Now, in terms of endogenous examples, there are countless examples across the continent as well as outside of the continent, right, of governments essentially not being accountable to their citizens. Coming in through very dubious means, not really being elected through free and fair elections, you know, clamping down on freedom of the press, clamping down on dissidents, not diversifying their revenue base because ultimately it serves a small elite number of people in these particular countries. So I would say that they're both external and internal examples of why these structural changes are not taking place.
Okay.
And I think the blame is to be placed at the foot of, you know, the quote-unquote developing world as well as the developed, quote-unquote developed world.
Okay. Rabtel Najai-Paley, unfortunately, we're out of time for this segment of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us. Well, that's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Remember, you can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.